Okay, it's 6 o'clock. Good evening, everybody. So just wanted to acknowledge, I believe Councilor Surratt and Will are on the phone. Are you guys with us?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Will? Not yet? Okay, great. So tonight we're going to hear from the city manager and the team about the proposed FY16 budget. And after that, we'll have some discussion about it. I also wanted to let you know that the format of the remaining two meetings has changed a little bit to include a public hearing on May 12th, beginning at 5:30, so that we'll have two opportunities to hear from the public. And then we'll take action on the FY16 proposed budget after the second public hearing on the 12th of May. So with that, I'll turn it over to John and Twyla to take us through the budget.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be back this year. And hopefully the most exciting thing about this year's budget is the new format. We're using Prezi rather than PowerPoint. It's the first time I've used that particular kind of a tool, so that may be the most exciting part about this year's budget. That's good news. And you know, I think the journey we've been on for the last 6 or 7 years has been a pretty interesting journey, and I'll spend just a couple minutes kind of recapping where we've been, at least to this point. And you might remember prior to the recession, or just as the recession was starting, the budget was structurally imbalanced, even at that point going into the recession. And that, when we meant structurally imbalanced, what that means is that our expenditures on an annual basis were exceeding our revenues. And again, we're talking about the general fund primarily. That's the piece of the budget that is primarily discretionary dollars that we fund police and fire and parks and finance and libraries and those kinds of things. But so going into the recession, we were structurally imbalanced. The recession hit, and then all of us know that pretty quickly we found ourselves trying to fill general fund gaps, starting with $5 and $12 million, and eventually had an accumulated gap of $30 million, which represented about 24% of the general fund. General fund was about $120 to $125 million. And so you might also remember we chose to approach that a little bit differently than other jurisdictions often do. What we said is we really wanted to balance a couple of things. One was maintaining services into the community, particularly during the recession, anytime, but particularly during the recession. We know that the services that we provide become extremely important, and we've... Hey, Will, can you mute? Thank you. The services that we provide as a city are particularly important, or were particularly important during the recession. So we wanted to maintain our services. We also said we wanted to minimize impact on our employees, and we generally thought about that as far as not laying off employees for a variety of reasons. One was that many had been with us for a long time. We wanted to be respectful and loyal to our employees. Two, we actually needed them to do the work through the recession. And three, it wouldn't help the local economy to actually have more people unemployed. And so everybody worked very hard in managing that, and with very few exceptions, nobody left the organization involuntarily. There were some sacrifices and things that our employees did make throughout the recession, so it wasn't pain-free by any means, but we worked very hard at that. And then we also said we wanted to continue to balance our budget, live within our means, which means that our expenditures would be equal to or less than our revenues, and we wanted to keep a responsible reserve throughout the recession period, or create a stable budget. And then lastly, we said that it was not only did we want to just try to survive through the budget, we wanted to be prepared for when the recession was over, and also to thrive, meaning that we continue to invest into the community. And so there has been a lot of those kinds of investments that have gone on for the last 5 or 6 years. And we balance some of these challenges as the economy would continue to dampen and to slow down, and our revenues would shrink. We saw some costs continuing to rise. You might remember, in addition to the recession hitting us, we also had to absorb the library levy, which was about $5 million back into the general fund. We were anticipating a couple of significant PERS increases that also had to be absorbed at the time. And of course, throughout the recession, people continued to have service demands that we wanted to balance. I think the really good news is through all of that, through the work of this committee and the council and the community and our staff, we did very good at managing the money part, I think exceptionally, but I also think the miracle is really all the other things that got accomplished during those 5 or 6 years. Whether we're talking about just a broad array of social service kinds of efforts, we've been piloting and trying a lot of new things around homelessness, rest stops, Opportunity Village, Operation 365. There have just been a whole host of things that we've been working on. Downtown is, for folks that have been around for a long time, I think would say that there's more activity and investment in the downtown that has occurred for really decades, and that's a great story that's been occurring. The fire merger between Springfield and Eugene occurred during this time, a lot of hard work by the folks on both sides of the freeway to make that a reality. Through all of that, actually the services have increased while the costs have decreased in that, and so that's a great story that we have. Triple bottom line has become a guiding principle and framework for us as we've been making decisions throughout this time, and there have been a whole lot of other things that have gone on. We've added Cahoots vehicles. We talk about facilities. City Hall is underway. The police department moved into a new facility. Our courts are in a nice place. Envision Eugene has been winding its way on its path for the last several years, and there's while we're still trying to figure out how to land a portion of that actually has been a really good conversation in this community. The Climate Recovery Ordinance is an example of things that we're moving forward on. We've acquired more parks and open space in the last 5 or 6 years than we have ever. We've supported Tracktown, the Olympic trials, the amount of road work. There's records being set at the airport. There's things with economic development, with rain, and a whole lot of things that have really gone on in the last 5 or 6 years, despite the worst recession since the 1930s. And so I think that's a really positive story. The graph on the left is my new favorite graph. And what the graph on the left says that for the forecast period, we're stable. That means our revenues exceed or are equal to our expenditures. And we haven't seen that for the last 6 years. And to give you just a couple of numbers, which I think is an interesting part of this story, leading into the recession, our revenues, and again in the general fund, kind of the operating side, our revenues were increasing at about 3.4% per year, 4.2% per year, and our expenditures were exceeding on average of 6.2% per year. So prior to the recession, we had this difference in the structural instability in our general fund. Coming out of the recession, as you can see, we're forecasting our revenues and expenditures to both be plus or minus about 3.1, 3.2%. So through the recession, we have fundamentally restructured our budget to be able to be positioned to move forward. And the good news is we're stable. Given the portfolio that we currently have today, we can support that portfolio going forward from here is what our forecast shows. So that's my new favorite graph on the left, shows stability. The one on the right also says, but we're not sustainable yet. What this shows is our reserve for revenue, that's our savings account in the general fund. We still use that to try to work through as we continue to balance our budgets. But the real key to this is in the last part of that forecast period, you see it starting to tick back up. What that means is as we move through the forecast, we're stable, As we get towards the end, we're actually starting to accumulate a little more cash than we're planning on expending. And again, that's within our current portfolio. So what this says is we're stable. We don't have extra money to be spending on new services and those kinds of things. So we're stable, which is great news. Our reserves, we're still drawing those down a little bit. We're at a comfortable place. We're not at that target of 8%, but you can see it sort of swings within that 4 plus or minus %. Starts to tick up in the out years, which is really the good news of this chart, which gives us some hope as we kind of move forward. So this is the FY16 proposed budget. A little over $500 million. This is all funds, and you can see how those break out. And again, what this is paying for is what you see today is what this budget is paying for tomorrow. There's a couple of very small but important exceptions to that. One is the Sheldon Branch Library, which had been put in as a one-time money this year, has been put in as an ongoing expense. So that's a real positive. We've also continued to put in the $250,000 of human services that was put in at one time last year. We put that in again at one time this year. And other than that, and Twyla will talk about a couple other little nuances, but other than that, the portfolio of services is what you see today. The general fund isn't the only fund we manage, of course, and so if you take a look at that $516 million of general fund, is you're going to find at a plus or minus $130 million. That's stable. That's great news. No gaps to fill. The airport fund is stable. We've been setting records every year for that. Tim Dahl and his team have done actually yeoman's work at finding and bringing in new flights. The ambulance transport fund is that particular fund that we're having, it's not stable. What you might know, might remember, is that the reimbursement rates continue to decrease. The service continues to increase. And so that creates a situation in which in the ambulance transport fund, we continue to draw down those reserves to try to cover those gaps. And as we know, we can't continue to use one-time money, savings account, to pay for ongoing costs, primarily personnel and equipment costs, and do that forever. Chief Groves and his folks have done a great job of managing that fund over the last several years. They're continuing to find ways to be very efficient with that. But it's an area in which we've earmarked as something we need to be very cautious of, and we'll spend some more time on this year trying to think more about how to create stability in that fund as well. The construction and rental housing fund, you might remember from several years ago, we were much more in a cautionary place, but as activity bumps up, there's additional dollars coming into that fund, which now allows us also to have the requisite personnel and supplies and materials we need in order to continue to review and inspect and ensure that development continues to occur in this community. The parking fund, this is not new that it's in a cautionary stage. If you were to look back over the last couple of years, you would see that that also has been in a cautionary stage. The good news about that is we've actually reduced their general fund transfer in the budget, so the parking fund is able to keep more of their dollars, which helps with this. And so the caution piece is they're not accumulating enough money in the reserves for their capital program. So if you were to take a look at their operations is matching pretty well, but they also have facilities and capital needs that are not being able to get programmed and replaced in the way that we need them to be replaced. And so, again, that's a cautionary, and we'll continue to work on that. The Public Safety Answering Point Fund, that's a new one that we haven't seen before, and that really those funds help pay for our 911 center, call taking and emergency dispatch center. And the revenues we receive from the state, telephone excise taxes, we're projecting them to decrease in the out years because there's fewer subscribers that are subscribing to essentially landlines that are paying for the 911 calls and things. So that's another one of those that we'll continue to watch over this next year and work through. These other utility funds are stable, which is great news. So I'm going to turn over to Twyla, and she'll talk about some more of the details, and I'll come back and wrap it up.
Great, thank you. So I'm Twyla Miller with the Finance Division, and I'm going to talk tonight about general fund revenue and expenditure trends and how those are impacting the forecast. So while there are over 30 reporting funds and 100 sub-funds that make up the city's financial structure, tonight we're going to review the general fund. The general fund's made up of 3 sub-funds: the main sub-fund, the cultural services sub-fund, and the equipment replacement sub-fund. Tonight, when I'm speaking about the general fund, I'm talking about the main sub-fund. As the city manager mentioned earlier, those are really the discretionary dollars of the organization, so that's what I will be referring to when we talk about the general fund. A schedule of the main sub-fund is on page 66 of your proposed budget document if you'd like to see that. So this chart shows the revenue components of the FY16 proposed budget. There are well over 100 different revenue sources that actually flow into this fund, but they can all be grouped into the categories you see here on the slide. Proposed revenues in the FY16 budget are $137.5 million, which is an increase of about 6.3% from the FY15 adopted budget. The categories with the greatest increase from the adopted budget were property taxes, which increased by about 6.9%, intergovernmental revenues, which represent state share revenues for cigarette and alcohol taxes, which increased by 9.9%, and then the other tax category, which is our SILT revenues that we receive from eWeb, and those increased by about 3.9%. Property taxes continue to be the major revenue source in the general fund at approximately $92 million in FY16. And that represents about 67% of general fund revenue. So this chart shows annual general fund revenue trends over time. And as you can see, the revenues stay flat in the mid-range of the chart, slowly increasing over the last couple of years there. In total, over this time period, the average annual growth rate for total revenues has been 2.1% over this time, with the average annual growth rate of property tax revenues at 3.3%. The rate of the growth in the other categories that we just saw on the last slide has varied, but between categories has not been higher than 1.4% annual average growth rate in a single category over this time period. As property taxes are a major component of general fund revenues, I'd like to talk a bit about a major driver affecting those revenues, which is assessed value. So assessed valuation is the value set on taxable property as a basis for levying property taxes. Future year increases in assessed value are generally limited to 3%. Assessed value is set at the beginning of each calendar year for the following fiscal year. So there's a lag between the economic factors and the impact of those changes on assessed value. This chart shows the drop that occurred in assessed value growth through the recession. From fiscal year 7 through fiscal year 10, assessed value was growing on average about 4.4% per year. This percentage is higher than the 3% limitation due to additions of properties to the tax rolls. During the downturn from fiscal year 11 through fiscal year 14, the average growth rate was 2.5%. That excludes the impact of the Hynex refund in fiscal year 11. As you can see on the far right of the chart, assessed value growth in FY15 has returned to pre-recession levels at 4.3%. With FY16 projected using a moderate growth rate of 4%, and I'll talk about growth rate assumptions next. So property tax revenues can be uncertain as future revenues are dependent on what happens with the economy and the dynamics of the property tax system. When we look to the future to forecast future property tax growth rates, a variety of factors are taken into consideration. including current information on assessed value from the county assessor, which we receive each October, and trends on property values and housing and building activity. We use all of this information to model a range of possible outcomes based on optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic growth assumptions. So when we incorporate growth rates into the forecast, we don't want to use projections that are overly optimistic, so that we don't have to cut services if those revenues don't materialize. However, we also don't want to use projections that are too pessimistic so that we don't overcorrect in the current year for something that may or may not occur in the future. So this slide shows the range of potential outcomes across the forecast period with our current projection represented by the blue line in the middle. This line reflects a moderate growth rate of 4%, which assumes the economy improves and growth occurs over time. The optimistic line reflects an accelerated growth rate between 4 and 5% over this time period, and the pessimistic model uses a growth rate of 3% throughout the forecast period. So while you can see that all the projections are fairly close when you look to the left of the slide for the first 2 years, the range of uncertainty really grows as we look to go throughout the forecast period. So now we'll take a look at expenditures. The two primary categories in the general fund operating budget are personnel and materials and services, or M&S. Most of the services we provide are people-driven, so police officers and firefighters for public safety and librarians for the library. So personnel expenditures comprise approximately 77% of our operating expenditures. This chart is showing the annual general fund expenditures in the main subfund from fiscal year 7 through 2016. You can see that expenditures from the general fund have remained fairly flat over the last 4 years, and this has been achieved through some of the things the city manager talked about earlier, the budget gap strategies in the general fund, which included a combination of reductions and funding shifts. In FY16, you see an uptick there. Expenditures increased by almost $8 million, or 6%. The increase is due to inflationary factors and cost of living adjustments, increased PERS rates, restoration of internal service fund rates to stable levels, and incorporating FY16 budget changes for items such as ongoing funding for the Sheldon Branch Library. And as we are heavily dependent on personnel, we watch PERS changes very closely. This chart shows the change in employer rates for the next budget year, as well as the total PERS costs in the general fund and all other funds in the city. Total PERS and OPSERP costs in the general fund are projected to increase by $1.3 million in the coming year. Remember that back in fiscal year 14, the legislature enacted PERS legislation, 3 bills to lower system costs and liabilities. Part of that legislation is currently being challenged through the courts, and we found out this morning that the Supreme Court is expected to make a ruling on this legislation or this litigation tomorrow. The current forecast assumes that the legislation is upheld, and that assumes lower PERS costs throughout the forecast period. If the legislation is overturned, our costs would be higher, and then we would have a budget gap. This impact is unknown as it's dependent on the outcome of the court decision. So there remains potential uncertainty about PERS costs moving forward. So the forecast really is a planning tool that projects the financial condition of the general fund over the next 6 years based on what we know to be true today. We use the forecast to understand the long-term impacts of decisions we make as an organization today. When we update the forecast, we look at how the organization is meeting 2 important financial goals. Are we living within our means, and do we have an adequate savings account? So as the city manager mentioned earlier, this is a great slide this year. The improved economic condition, along with the strategies we've enacted over the last 6 years, have resulted in a stable service system where existing revenues are greater than or equal to expenditures in most years of the forecast period. So we've met one of our financial goals, and we're living within our means and have a stable budget. Here we're looking at the reserve for revenue shortfall, which is our savings account. The red line shows the history of the adopted budget reserve for revenue shortfall and our projection over the forecast period as projected as compared to our 8% target reserve level, which is shown by the green dotted line. While we anticipate increasing reserves in the short term, which you can see there, We will also use those reserves to soften the financial impact from anticipated changes from items such as increased PERS rates in FY18. We expect to be below target levels, as the city manager mentioned previously, throughout the forecast period, but by the end of the forecast period, we are seeing that uptick. Given our current assumptions, the reserve is beginning to increase, which is really good news. So in the past, when we've drawn down our reserve, we've built it back up so that we can have an adequate and stable savings account moving forward. It will be important for us to continue to identify future one-time resources to add to the reserve to rebuild our savings account and maintain our high bond rating. And now I will turn things back over to the city manager to talk about the FY16 proposed budget.
So what you can see here is really, again, this is the general fund portion of the budget. And the police and the fire occupy the largest portion of the budget, as you can see by the pie graph. And then you can just kind of get a sense of where all of these various places are, including all the subfunds. I think this is an interesting graph, and if we were actually to have this graph go back over the last several years, it gives kind of a good sense of where, while we've eliminated $30 million in the general fund, and we've been very strategic about that, what we would find is over this period of time, the police budget has generally increased throughout this time, albeit not huge amounts, and there's been impacts, but particularly when we added the downtown policing staffing, that made a significant difference in the police budget. Fire and EMS over the period of time has generally been flat, but as you can see, kind of upticked in the proposed budget. Library, recreation, and cultural services over the last several years, you would see that has been on a downward side, but again, going from 15 to 16, moving back up. Part of that has to do with Sheldon Branch Library. Planning and development has remained generally flat. Public works is not a particularly large general fund item. It's parts of the Parks Department. O&M is actually in the general fund. And then our central services, and Twyla mentioned it earlier, one of the things that we've been doing the last 5 years, appropriately so, is the fund balances within those funds, the risk fund, it's a good example, fleet and all, they've also been using their reserves to help moderate their rates to the rest of the organization. And so part of the budget strategy this year is to sort of stop that use and sort of cap that off, which now allows them to start operating as a stable place as well. And so the general fund isn't just stable, we're actually trying to create stability across all our internal service funds. Several of those rest in central services, and so as you see the uptick, that's a real positive for us. This is on the capital side. We had the capital improvement plan. It was before the budget committee a couple of months ago, and so we went through the details of that. This is just the budget representation of that plan that you saw back at that particular time. So here's the things that are different from last year's budget. Mentioned the Sheldon Branch Library staffing, looking at that as ongoing as opposed to just one time. The Human Services, $250,000 that was put in last year is again in this year as a one-time fund. We've also accounted for sick leave pay for temporary employees. That's the ordinance that you passed. If the state passes something, we would assume that to be somewhat similar. And so the general fund portion of that is $300,000 or so that we have built into the budget for that. And then also we've put in some money for a BOLI contract. We're not quite sure how that will play out, depending again on what the state does, but there is some money in this budget to pay for that, to enforce if we have that obligation as part of our city. There are a couple of other things, though, that we've also built in that we think will also pay off into the future. We, several years ago, we implemented something we call the Victory Garden inside the organization, and really the intent of that was to ask all employees to submit ideas on budgets, ways that we can be more efficient, things that we can do differently. And we did that early on in the budget strategy process several years ago, and this year we opened it up again, not as much about how to find budget efficiencies, but are there some opportunities to use one-time money and turn that into an ongoing benefit to us. And so what you see in that center portion there are ideas that the employees have come up with, are ways to use some one-time money, which we hope to capture some ongoing benefit to. They're not all in the general fund. Parking is a good example of that, but they do have benefit within the budget as a whole. Back on Supplemental Budget 1, there were several others that we had already, you had already funded as part of Supplemental Budget 1, some one-time money for additional ideas that the employees have come up with. And so we're hoping that those will have some, we'll see the fruits of those in the out years. And then there were a couple other things as some of the services and the demands have increased. We've put in some money for those. In the evidence control staffing at EPD, that's the one general fund portion of that. For a 2-year period, we're bumping up their staffing by $250,000 for a couple of additional personnel for those years to help them catch up on that evidence control, their property control. And so that will make a big difference for them. The building permit inspectors and the plans reviewer, those are positive. Those are paid for by dollars that are generated from the outside, so they pay for themselves. But that's also an indicator that the activity of development is on the upswing, and so we need some more to help do those plans. So the FY16 proposed budget stabilizes our finances, provides funding for council priorities in the same way next year as we have for this year. We continue to look for efficiencies going forward. The Victory Garden is a good example of those, and really trying to position ourselves for the future. We've used this similar kind of a graph every year because really as we think about our budget, it really fits into a larger context of not just fiscal, but it's about really community prosperity. And so financial stewardship for the last 6 years, as you know, we've been working really hard at living within our means, revenues and expenditures, equaling, using one-time money for one-time expenses, maintaining a responsible reserve as we move forward. But we've also, for the last 6 years, spent a lot of time as an organization and community trying to increase our economic prosperity. And we see that in downtown. We see that by the RAIN project. That's when we talk about the riverfront research or the riverfront eWeb property. Those are all really investments in economic prosperity in the community. And then there are a number of other goals that we continue to invest in and that the community and the council and this committee have talked about. And there are some things that we really have some work to do from a sustainability standpoint. We've talked a little bit about libraries of the future. What are those services? What is the library that we're looking for into the future? Parks and recreation, operations and maintenance, as we know. While we may be stable in the fund, we know that our parks and recreation facilities, the long-term maintenance really needs to be addressed, and we're starting those kinds of things as well. And so from what we're really encouraging is we have stability, and so what this provides us is an opportunity to not look back at how do we fill gaps, but we can really pivot towards fiscal sustainability. Where do we want to be as a community when it comes to an array of city services, and how do we start thinking about achieving those services? So here's the bottom line from my perspective. We're stable. We need to continue fiscal discipline. We're not sustainable yet, but we're in a place in which we can start really looking towards the future, towards a community of where do we want to be, not just looking back at what we weren't able to do. And so I think we're in a great place to start having that kind of conversation. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Laura.
Thank you. So those were great slides, by the way. Love the new program.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Yeah, really cool.
And it's easy to operate?
Nifty. That's the right word, nifty. So before we move into the discussion, as John said, we're now in a place of stability, and so I think we really have the opportunity to be thoughtful and strategic about talking about long-term goals and how we build a sustainable budget that reflects the community's priorities and how we can also identify ongoing revenues to fund those priorities going forward. So I know council, as I understand it, is considering some of these. John referred to a few of those about libraries of the future, parks and recreation, additional conversations about homelessness, and some of those kind of bigger strategic things that require some time to really figure out what the right solution is. So I know that we'll talk a little bit about the multi-year financial plan, I believe, next Tuesday?
The 12th.
On the 12th? Okay. And so that will, again, kind of focus us a little bit on the longer-term unfunded needs. And so, we'll have some choices to make, I think, about services and ongoing revenues and how we want to look at that going forward. So I think we have a really great opportunity to allow ourselves to really reflect and have sort of more of a policy-level discussion that talks about how do we weigh and address service needs, service levels, what are revenue alternatives, what are those strategies, and how can we, as a budget committee, provide feedback and represent the citizen viewpoint as well, those of us who are citizen members to the council for what some of those priorities strategically should be. So, okay, I already saw Councillor Clark in the queue, so we'll go ahead and get started with discussion. Councillor Clark.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate the presentation, sir. That was done very well. It was an awful nifty system, too, and I liked it. That was cool. My first question is, why is it a good idea at the end of June in 2016 to have a $65.3 million UEFB?
So the UEFB is set by policy at 2 months' worth of operating expenditures. And that's really a mechanism that we can use between when we have property taxes, when the budget starts in July and when we receive property taxes in November. So that allows us to pay all our bills, payroll, contractors, and all of those things without borrowing money. So that's set at that adopted budget level.
It's a self-insure against collection rate going down, right?
It's really, we would have to borrow money to meet payroll and make payments on things. If we don't have a UEFB, we wouldn't have receipted property taxes in that time period.
It seems large to me. That's why I asked, but I heard you say the 2-month part.
Can I just add, it's $23 million, which is...
The page 3, top, lists $65.3 million. That's what I thought I saw.
That's all funds, that's UEFB and other kinds of balances in all of the other funds.
Okay.
That's why it looks large.
Okay. One of the things we didn't talk about in this presentation, maybe another one, is just for year-to-year comparison's sake, is collection rate. And is that a piece we'll get at some point in the future? Is that information germane right now? I mean, we never had an issue. We've always had a very high collection rate, and we had a little bit of a dip, as I recall. So I'm asking because I'm wondering what that looks like now and where it's going.
Our collection rate remains high, so it hovers within
95?
just under 95%. So it's hovered between 94.3 and just under 95%. So it's remained fairly constant. So we didn't talk about it this evening, but we're anticipating that continued level of collection.
Thank you. That's it.
Okay. So, Marty, you're next.
These aren't the biggest items on the menu, but they are the ones that people have been asking me about. So there are 3 of them real quick. Neighborhood services. Constituents have asked that we restore some of the funding for outreach to the neighborhood associations. Mostly this goes to postage, I think. I think we need to look at whether the current system is really equitable. Some of the wealthier parts of the cities are receiving a disproportionate share of these funds, while the poorer parts of the cities often have inactive neighborhood associations. Also, the quality of the newsletters and outreach is variable, shall we say. I'd like to ask the city manager whether we might achieve more equitable result if we rededicate the funds to providing a part-time staffer to assist the neighborhood associations with their outreach effort, including an efficient means of communication with all the city residents, while saving part of the funds for that staffer to distribute content generated in cooperation with the neighborhood associations. So basically, let's in-house some of the function and, make it go more. And I'm not asking you right now. This is just more long-term. Animal services is the second one. We definitely need to replace the First Avenue shelter, and I appreciate the staff's done some preliminary work on that. It seems to me we probably need to get a group together to develop some alternatives. I would include Green Hill, the county, the police, No-Kill Lane County, perhaps the veterinary medicine programs at Lynn Benton and Oregon State. Given the need for the service, the likely need for increased revenue to provide it, and the strong disagreement in the community about how it should be provided, it seems like there needs to be a public process where we can work these things out. Because even if you're right, you're wrong, unless there's a public process in this town about these things. On municipal court, we spend $4.6 million on Muni Court. The budget provides for part-time presiding judge, part-time associate judge, and 5 assistant judges, which seems like kind of a lot of part-time employees. Given the benefits overhead for public employee and the contract overhead, if you contract them out, it seems to make more sense to have more full-time staff and fewer contract staff. Similarly, due to conflicts, it's inevitable you're going to have to contract out some defense services, but in my experience, the quality of defense services and often the efficiency of the service is much better if you have at least a core of in-house people. So it seems like we've been very successful with the municipal prosecutor with in-housing part of that function and being thoughtful about how we contract it out, pieces of it out, and keep pieces of it in. And so I would hope that we will look at delivering that service in a more efficient way for that.
I can
Very much.
That might be helpful on a couple. On the neighborhood, we'll get back to you on that by next week. The animal services, my guess is nobody would disagree that we need new improved animal service shelter facilities. And so this would be an area in which if the budget committee and the council says, yes, let's spend some time over the next year really looking at that whole topic, it might be a germane topic for next year's budget or the capital side of the budget or whatever the right timing of that is. And so that would be kind of a good conversation for like the third meeting of this group to say, yes, that's something we want to spend some time on the next year or not, or however we want to do that. So I think that would be a great topic. And your last one with the municipal court, one of the things that we are doing is really taking a look at a community justice system, which really takes a look at how do we provide that entire prevention, intervention, the whole prosecution side into the enforcement, into the accountability side, jails often, and all of those different pieces, how do they interact, and are there some different models and opportunities to do some kind of thing. So I think some of what you're talking about will be incorporated in that conversation, which we are doing over this next year to really think about how that whole system can focus really on a broad array of parts of that, to the community justice system.
Thank you.
So something that will be incorporated in that.
Thank you. Councilor Brown.
Thank you. Yeah, I just have a couple brief follow-up questions to 2 of the topics that Marty just spoke about. The first one is about funding for the neighborhood organizations, and there was no reduction last year, but this year, still in this year, but I think there was one the year before.
30,000.
And the concern that I've been hearing from constituents, mostly, of course, in my ward, but other people from other neighborhood leaders from other wards too, is that they have had to, they can't do as many mailings as they used to do. And naturally, I think that's going to vary from organization to organization. I'll just pick an example. The friendly area neighbors, when I go to those meetings, they're really well attended. And when an important issue like, say, the restriping of South Willamette or something about Civic Stadium or something like that, the Washington Park Cottage is packed. It's standing room only. And then I've been to other neighborhood meetings where there's 3 people. And so that's, I believe, why the amounts maybe vary. But yes, I would agree that there should be an equitable distribution. And I know this is not the time to make motions, but I'll probably make a motion to restore that funding back up to the original, because I think it's really important for keeping the neighborhoods informed. People can come together and make decisions. So I guess that wasn't really a question, was it? But the funding was cut 2 years ago.
Yeah, there was $30,000 cut out.
30, yeah. That seems like a reasonable amount. We should be able to find that somewhere. The other question was also on the idea of the new animal shelter, and part of my question was answered by just the recent discussion. But I was just wondering I think it's really important. I mean, when I first moved here over 40 years ago, I lost my dog and went out there, and I had to retrieve. And then I went out more recently, and it was bad back then. It's pretty miserable now. And not that people don't do the best they can. They do a great job there, the staff. I'm not saying it's the facility itself. It's pretty obvious it needs to be replaced. And I realize we can't just say, well, let's just take $10 million and build a new one, next month. We can't do that. It has to be So I like the idea of getting everybody together in council, talking about it more and talking to all the stakeholders and trying to make it happen. I guess my question for this one was the answer to Marty's original question. First, it says the concept for a new shelter is being developed by the Green Hill Humane Society, but nothing has been agreed to. Do we even know a ballpark figure of what the cost might be to replace the? Has anyone heard? I mean,
I haven't
just
heard
don't
of
know.
anything.
Okay. All right.
The Safe Haven one in Tangent was built for about $6 million, so not inconsiderable.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you.
And Councilor Brown, I'll address the process for motions at the end of the meeting before
Sure.
we adjourn.
Right. Thank you.
So, Josh?
Thank you. I guess many comments down in the details, but I'll actually make none of those here unless it turns out we have a lot of extra time. But I want to just acknowledge that I completely agree about the amazing progress. I actually really appreciated your email last fall about homelessness in particular. It's amazing that we've been able to achieve a whole bunch of those things, and I really appreciate all the work by the staff. I really feel like my overwhelming impressions strictly from a budget perspective is that we need to revisit the discussion of revenue sources that this group started and did a bunch of hard work before I was here, so thank you for that. And then talk about those unfunded aspirations in the multi-year financial plan. But setting that aside for a moment, I have something that is, I guess, a constructive criticism, though maybe it's easier to clear up and you can help me. As a budget, this is totally clear. It's very clear, and I learned a tremendous amount from it, an embarrassing amount, actually. Too bad I learned that much. But as a policy document, it's not so clear. And by that I mean it's actually pretty hard to detect progress toward or away from policy goals of various kinds in here. And I don't want to put all of that work on the budget, but this is our big chance to look at how we're allocating resources. So despite all of this quantitative detail, there's actually very, very little quantitative insight into progress towards specific policy objectives that are related to so many of these things. So let me focus on two pieces that won't surprise anyone. I want to say something about the pedestrian and bicycle master plan project list, and then something about the climate recovery ordinance, neither one of which is specifically on the hook of folks preparing the budget, and I understand that, but maybe that's sort of the systemic issue. Maybe this is to be answered next year, but that's why I'm bringing it up this year. So the pedestrian and bicycle master plan there are things being done to chip away at that long project list that was identified a few years ago in the plan. But I'm not mentioning that list just because I think those projects are good. I'm mentioning them because that project list embodies a whole range of goals and policy objectives that Council has approved related to transportation and land use, 20-minute neighborhoods in Envision Eugene and many other aspects of Envision Eugene, and then of course climate objectives and ones that predate the climate recovery ordinance. So it's just very difficult to see where we are there. I guess my question is, where do we see progress toward completing these things? And I can do some of the division that I alluded to in a previous meeting, where you say it's about a $60 million project list. We're doing about $500,000 from the bond measure per year, so we're funding it over approximately a century, give or take. But I know that math isn't quite right. The problem is that I actually can't do better math based on what's in here. So
Josh, you're out of time. Do you want me to add you to the second queue to continue?
I'll go into the second queue. At least I finished my first one.
Great. Thanks. So I would actually I put myself into the queue next just to build a little bit on, Josh, on what you said, not all of it, not the parts where you can't see the progress, but I think the part where you refer both to the work that was done by the revenue team last year as well as the importance of the budget as a tool for policy conversations. I think we're at a really unique and really, I think, a great opportunity to actually focus our conversation there because we've gotten to stability, which I know took a lot of hard work from this group and the city and council and a lot of people. And we do need to go back to that revenue work and probably additional revenue work that may need to happen as well. But how can we take this opportunity to look at what are the priorities for next year? I know you've talked about some of those here. Maybe it's looking at animal services. Maybe it's looking at neighborhood services. I know there's been additional conversations about homelessness. What are those priorities for the coming year and then the coming maybe even 5 years? And what do we hear from the community that those priorities are? And what do we think those priorities are? And then how are we going to match those with the revenues that are going to enable us to do them in the long run? So that's exactly where I'm excited that we have the chance to focus our conversation. So great. You certainly may get into the queue. And did you want to be in the second queue? Okay, great. Yes, go ahead, Councilor Surratt.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make a brief statement and thank the city manager for the budget presentation. So, obviously it's great to have a stable budget without new cuts being proposed. And we got here through the hard work of our city manager and our city staff, the budget committee, city council, and community members. And, I want to thank everyone for all that work. But I also must remind us that we did not do this without a real sacrifice, and some folks have already been mentioning that. We've cut library hours significantly. We have an ever-growing backlog of park maintenance issues. We've been unable to begin development of other parks. We've reduced our general fund contributions to human service needs. And we've reduced funds and FTE for neighborhood services and other issues. And then we've backburnered issues like what has already been mentioned, our dilapidated animal services building, among others. So I don't mean to be a bummer, but I just want to remind us, and also those who have criticized us for our past attempts to raise additional revenue, that we have a whole host of ongoing funding needs that are not addressed in this budget. So while I am leaning towards supporting the city manager's call for caution against the temptation to be cat back in this budget year, I'm very aware that we've got more work to do on prioritizing the use of our resources. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the community at our next meeting to hear what kind of feedback we get on this budget and their ideas for what they're wanting to see from the city. So, and then I've got some other comments and questions, but I'm going to save those for our next meeting.
Great, thank you. So I have Bob, you're in the queue next.
Thank you. Thank you, city manager, staff, for your presentation tonight. I guess I have some observations. Maybe they can be considered questions in referring to your favorite chart. I think one of the things that is of concern to me is there was a large amount of projected growth, 20% over the next 5 years in terms of revenue and expenditures. That's a fairly significant increase over where we are today. Part of my concern is almost 70% of our revenue is generated by property taxes. Will property tax, and I know we've seen the chart, be able to sustain that type of a growth? That is a concern to me. I've always been a proponent that we try to look for additional revenue sources. I feel our committee has kind of dropped that ball this year. We've had an easier time. Tonight's a much more calm meeting than it was a year ago. There's no gnashing of teeth, pulling of hair.
Not yet.
Not yet. Could get there. I will caution all of us on the side of being careful now that we have a stable budget, not to try to rush to increase and get back what we once had, because the revenue isn't going to sustain that type of, well, let's throw another 50,000 here, let's put 30,000 there, let's build this, let's buy that. We have a stable budget. Let's enjoy it for a while and try to continue to work towards a positive growth. And I think this committee's been doing that over the last 3 years. I think we've had some really hard work to do. I wish we had done a little more work this year picking up from what the revenue team started last year to possibly give staff some of those extra funds that everyone's wishing we could be spending right now. But thank you for your presentation.
Great, thank you. Anyone else who would like to get in the first queue before we move into the second queue? No? Okay, so Josh, you're up again.
Well, I'll be super quick. I said with the pedestrian bicycle master plan, my second example is just going to be the climate recovery ordinance. I want to acknowledge this is not an old ordinance, but it's also not that new, 9 months or so since it was passed. And actually the goals that are in the climate recovery ordinance were, came out of the Sustainability Commission almost 5 years ago and went to council and were approved then. So actually we've had this stuff on the books for a while. As these issues have become more important and more recognized by council, and you guys have passed a number of resolutions related to climate change in the last few years, it would be great for us to see some alignment here, that there's some way to understand the progress that we're making. So it's a big ask, it's a vague ask, but sort of that's from the level at which we have to look at things. I feel like we need a better line of sight there.
Great, thank you. Councilor Clark, you're up again.
Thank you. Well, we have we've stemmed the hemorrhaging, I guess, of the backlog of deferred maintenance in public works and with regard to roads, with the bond and with all the work that's been done in the last few years. We still have a considerable backlog, and we have an O&M problem that isn't solved in public works there, as I understand it. Last year, we ended this process with a maintenance policy towards our parks where we weren't watering a lot of this stuff during the course of the year. Is that where we still are, at that same kind of maintenance level as we head into the summer this year?
Yes, the budget that you see before you is the same level of service as we have this year.
So with regard to just basic watering and mowing in city parks, we're not going to be doing that at all, or just in some places, not in others?
Whatever it is today will be also tomorrow. So I'm not sure what the specifics of each particular park are. And
I ask that because that's a very public and easy to see sign of want on the part of the city with regard to our services, is when people see that in the course of the summertime. And so we have a lot of things that, as Claire mentioned, not only need to be built back up, but we have some things that are still at emergency levels that haven't been at least brought up to a normal standard of things. And so I suppose it's good for us to talk about larger, where do we go in the future? My first one would be, how do we stabilize O&M and parks maintenance? But at the same time, I fully expect that we're going to see new ideas for ways to spend little bits of money here and there. We'll get asks during the public hearings. And I too, there's a proposal in front of council. I'd be interested in the budget committee members' notion of us sending $50,000 to Kathmandu, which is a proposal before council at this time. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other, oh, okay, Jill.
Question for the city manager. So I think last year there was some discussion about the parks. I too, as Councilor Clark, are very worried about the parks and maintaining them, especially with the acquisition of new parks. I think we talked a little bit about the possible public-private combination of maybe getting some of our private partners, corporations, involved in that maintenance, sponsor a park, sponsor a swing set type of a thing. Has there been any discussion on that or conversation about that within the city staff?
What we can do is we'll ask our Public Works folks to actually provide some information ahead of Tuesday's meeting. I don't know specifically, but what I do appreciate is in both of these comments and others, when we talk about a stable budget, what we're talking about is that we're not trying to fill gaps. But as several of you have mentioned, it doesn't mean it's where we want to be when it comes to levels of services. It means we're not trying to figure out how to water less. It just means we're not watering more yet, but we're watering what we're watering. And so I think all of those are very apropos, but we will provide some additional information for you for next week, or when our next meeting is.
Thank you. And if I may add one comment, I know our job is not to discuss revenues, and I was on the revenue committee, and I personally, quite frankly, didn't feel that people were there a lot, and everyone there participated fully and had great ideas, but I'm not really sure where it went, actually. And so, that would be a concern about, I'd be interested in where that information went and what, if anything, that council had an opportunity or found interesting from those conversations, even though I know it's not the budget committee's job. And then again, like with the parks, right, anything we can think of that, again, has, not only does it have a to-do item, spending component, but also a revenue component. And that's kind of why I thought, bringing in private corporations might be a way to do that, low-impact way. Mm-hmm. High profile. Right.
I know over the past year the council has had several conversations that are either directly or indirectly related to revenue. So as we've talked about parks and recreation maintenance, there's been updates around where we are with that as far as the actual out on the field, but also options for revenue, new revenues in those cases. So there have been some of those conversations. Libraries, similarly, around Library of the Future and adding services. That's been a part of our conversations that the council has had. So,
great. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of jump on a comment that Councilor Clark just made. And I'm going to start off with a question. Have we, in any one of our little pockets, squirreled away money that would be designated as an emergency relief fund? Do we have that little cachet anywhere?
we don't have anything like an emergency relief fund, if that's what you're, in that sense. The council every year through this process designates a contingency, which is used for any number of things through the year, unanticipated expenses that they choose to pay for. So that's probably the closest that we have to something like that.
We don't have anything set aside where we could, as a governmental entity, send a contribution to Kathmandu.
It's not designated as such. If the council chose to do that, what we've committed to is coming back next Tuesday, actually, with funding options for that particular conversation that they had today at their work session. And so I don't know where all those potentials are, but we'll be coming back next Tuesday for the council to have that conversation.
So to answer your question, Councilor Clark, I would not be in favor of it. And it's not because I'm heartless. It's because that isn't part of our process. If the city of Eugene wants to make a contribution, I would say set up an account at one of our local-owned banks and encourage the citizens to make contributions to it, act as the conduit to collect it, and then send it. And let the hearts of our citizens and their wallet determine the size of that, and not just extract it out of a budget that is now stable, with a lot of people, as you say, wanting to add a little bit here and a little bit there to it, when we still are not at all the levels we want to be at.
Chelsea.
So another role I serve for the city is I'm on the Library Advisory Board, and I'm actually the Sheldon representative for that board. So I just wanted to make the comment that I'm really glad to see that Sheldon is included as an ongoing expense. I think that's a part of the heart of the community that I live in Eugene, and really better reflects the values of our community. So I was really pleased to see that. I also wanted to mention that as a part of that board, we've been working on the Library of the Future vision. And one thing I'm really proud about that work is that as we hopefully have some more funds for the library in the future, we're thinking about how we can use those funds in a different way. We're not saying how can we just bring back what we had, but we're trying to think of new ways to really, in particular, think about that equity piece of the triple bottom line and get books into the hands of different folks in our community. And I think that's a great example for us to think about as we look at maybe if we're looking at it sounds like we're going to have conversations about maybe 5 years in the future, Laura, you mentioned. But just to keep that in mind, that we don't need to bring things back exactly how they were before, but we can be creative and think about what we need as we're looking towards the future. Another, I guess, request I have is it seems like we're getting a lot of comment around the neighborhood communications funding, I think what it's after. And I know from our neighborhood there's some rules around how many mailings you have to send out, and in order to get that funding, there's probably other rules, but if we could get sort of an abbreviated version of what all those rules are, that would be great, just to have that context for the discussion I think is coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll provide some of that for Tuesday. Yeah, you bet. For our next meeting, is it Tuesday? Okay, it is Tuesday. Okay.
Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, and it sounds like Councilor Brown heard from some of the same people, but I heard quite a bit from a large group of neighborhood leaders outside of, the neighborhood association I'm in. So I want to second that. Any materials you can provide would be great.
Anything else that would be valuable for the city manager or staff to have ready for us to discuss over the next couple meetings? Any other areas that are questions? Yeah.
I just raised what occurred to me with regard to parks maintenance as something that's a very visible shortcoming that we, thought was sensible based on emergency times. I'm sure there are others that aren't jumping to mind that are probably important to a lot of people. If we're going to have any kind of conversation about adding back unexpected expenditures to this budget, I would want to have a more thorough list of some of the stuff we've cut over the last couple of years, or some of the ways we've changed service levels in a way that's dramatic, because I wouldn't want to, for example, make a decision because we're in a stable place to do something over here when we've had to cut this dramatically, and and restoring some of it would be a higher priority. So I don't know how that information would be gathered for our benefit, but
well, one of the things that I would say, and this is probably not the answer you're going to look for at the moment, is remember the $30 million is ongoing cost. We actually did ongoing stuff, which creates the budget that we have. And so as you look at, and Bob articulated it very well, as you look at the revenues and expenditures going forward, being what we think are responsible projections at the moment, those plus or minus are equal. And so I will encourage us not to add back ongoing costs regardless of whether it's sort of reaching back or going forward within the current budget portfolio. And so we can provide all the things that have gone on, but those are all ongoing costs, and so that's different than if there's a one-time cost here or there. So I'm not sure how to.
My sense of things are, based on our comfort level, is that it's not so much that there are going to be a bunch of proposals for how to spend money on a long-term basis we don't have, but we're going to start to have conversations around visioning of if, for example, our very long-term prognosis is for growth and for greater stability. How do we build a roadmap from here to the place we really want to be? And what I'm looking at is what are those competing catch back up pieces as opposed to potential new things we might do.
And I think this is
for a longer term plan.
So part of how some of this ties in, and this gets a little bit at yours, Josh, is the council's been having their conversations around priorities, outcomes through a couple work sessions and retreats, and those will be coming back. And so part of that process, what we hope is, starts to help sift out those priorities around some of those things, which then help set the stage for future conversations within this group as well. So I think that's where part of that will sort itself out.
Thank you. Sue, I think you wanted to add something.
I did. We also, want to think ahead about where do we want to go? What are those things that would be included in a sustainable budget? And we actually have a list in your budget document. So it's not looking back at what was cut, but it's looking forward at what we think the organization needs for the future, some of which is, parks maintenance is inadequate, but some of it is libraries of the future, are different services maybe than we've cut, but there's still some needs there. So the multi-year financial plan is our document for doing that. It's the last tab in your book, and it's 70 pages of information about different service areas and what the unfunded needs are, both on the capital and the operating side. So
in the tiny little document, I'll look for that last tab.
Okay, not in that one.
I know, in the notebook. I know, that's what.
All right, well done.
Thank you
Okay,
very
great.
much.
Marty.
There's a placeholder for homeless services in the unfundeds, and for those of us who might be inclined to think about shifting things around, it would be useful to have some idea from the staff about where that money could most effectively be spent at various levels, just so, it's not just, well, I think X dollars would be effective, but gee, if we were going to move this, this is what we think would be an effective way of spending that money. Similarly,
Where is that?
Where is
that?
there's an unfunded there's an unfunded placeholder in the, you have it down at $1 or something.
Is that in the multi-year financial?
Okay. Yeah, it's a different thing. Okay.
We'll figure out how to spend the dollar, but I think that that will tie actually to the council's conversation around their priorities around homelessness, which will then inform us around how best to achieve that outcome. So that's an active conversation, right?
Okay. And also non-cash transfer ways of doing it. I mean, we've been very effective in the past about, well, okay, you can use this land because we don't have any cash. So if you have any of those ideas. Thank you.
So thank you. So you had the mayor and then Jeff. So I had a quick question. So it looked like this year we added back in one-time funding for human services, 200,000, 250,000, something like that, right? So is the idea there that we add that back in such that then as council continues to have a conversation about some related issues, we can develop a longer-term plan? Because I know that's just one time. So is there a longer-term plan around that, or is that still part of what is being discussed?
Yeah. I just nuance the words a little bit, and it's not that important. We didn't actually add it back in, we're just continuing it from this year.
Okay, yes, fair enough. Okay,
Sure.
Yeah.
The part of the council conversation through their retreat process and the work session is around social services, more specifically around homelessness, and the topic has been brought up about how best to spend any of the dollars around human services that we currently contribute, not just HSC. And so that may be a conversation that the council takes on, which again may inform this committee in subsequent years around policy, which then we and the budget committee then talk about how best to achieve that policy financially.
Great, thank you. Mayor Piercy.
Thank you. It just occurs to me that part of what we're doing here is having this conversation with each other, but the second part of this is you're having this conversation with the community about the budget choices that you're making. So it seems to me it's going to be important for you to be able to tell the story of what that means in their lives, because if nobody's squealing, people may not be thinking about the library or the parks, because that's sort of built into the budget discussion. But the fact is, you can't make decisions to put new stuff in there when you haven't really told people that those other things are still out there. So there is kind of this kind of story, but there's also the story of what's really happening and what must guide our decisions, that is about services that we don't have in place that we would like to have. And so I don't know how you put how we do that in a way that puts council goals and budget discussion together, but I think the community is going to react to who's telling the new stuff. And so being able to really do a good job of articulating what's still out there to be dealt with that we already have on the table before you start new stuff, I think is a really important job we have to do.
Thank you. Josh, did you have another comment?
Yeah, and this is to respond to the question. I think this was the question. What else could you potentially provide to help us digest the multi-year financial plan? Right? Is that sort of a question? Okay. I'll pretend it was. And Ford said. But this is in line with what Councilor Clark just said as well, but sort of this big picture. I was struck in going through the multi-year financial plan about how different how many different categories are there, and some of it's called out, and in the one-page snapshots, it's helpful to see capital versus operating expenses called out, but it's almost like there's some other level of nuance, and this may relate to what the mayor just said too. It's like we have one-time capital investments that require maintenance, so like community centers, and so it's sort of, there's capital, but then there ends up being a maintenance line if the years are there to show it. And then we have one-time capital investments that might actually pay for themselves, like the LED lights going in or energy efficiency improvements of public buildings. So those actually look very different. And then we have capital investments or things that are formally capital that actually are part of this ongoing deferred maintenance backlog, like transportation spending. And then we have operations categories that seem to have serious implications that are really hard to put dollar values on if we don't fund them. I was very struck by the size of the emergency services numbers here, what's unfunded in the next 5 years, partly police, but especially other services. And then we have other things that are just sort of shortfalls in operating what we have, and parks maintenance is clearly the biggest single example of that. And then maybe there's another category, it's something about staff efforts to chase other dollars. The homelessness one is the only one I can think of off the top of my head. But it seems like there are sort of more categories, and the snapshots here are a little bit, it's sort of hard to see that. So when we get to the stage of really discussing those priorities, if there's another, I don't know, if something got left on the cutting room floor that you can bring back to express those, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Councilor Pryor.
In a way, this year's budget discussion is an extension or a continuation of the last couple of years of budget discussions. And those of us that remember those last couple of years, remembered how painfully we went through the process of, in a way, prioritizing, because we had a whole list of things we had to start saying, what operationally are we going to continue to do and what are we not? So we were prioritizing, maybe not at the philosophical level, but definitely at the operational level. And I want to build on that work because I know staff has already built on that work. And when we finished last year, we had a budget, it balanced, but it left a couple of squishy elements that we were uncomfortable with and we wanted to figure out how to deal with this year. And I'm appreciative of the fact that we have dealt with them and achieved stability, but human service funding is a good example. It's still a one-time expenditure. It's still a conversation that needs to occur. But in the context of this year's budget, I don't know how productive a conversation we could have. But for me, it's still an issue. It's an operational priority issue that needs to be talked about, as is park watering or libraries or other things. But our short-term task is to appreciate we've achieved stability through that painful process, and I don't know how much we can monkey with this year's budget and still honor the work we did and maintain the stability. And so what we need to do is think in terms of what is it going to take to get this year's budget approved, knowing there are new interests that are surfacing. And those new interests are natural, they're normal, and they're desirable, but I don't think it's wise for us to try to accommodate those new interests in this budget. But I think figuring out a process for how we can talk about it for future budgets, because we've raised some very interesting questions, some very interesting issues, not just philosophically, but operationally. And I do think we should deal with them, but we should try to operate on both planes. How can we get this budget approved in a way that maintains this last slide, and then figure out how to incorporate the conversation, and it may go beyond this budget committee. It probably should go beyond this budget committee for talking about how to increase the level of stability for those additional interests that we have. I think it's absolutely doable, but I don't want us to get mixed up in terms of the immediate task versus this longer-term task.
Thank you. Okay, any other final comments or questions for tonight? No? Okay, if not, we'll give you 10 minutes to enjoy the sunshine outside. So before we adjourn, if you do have any motions that you would like to kind of get into the queue for the next couple meetings, please go ahead and send those to Twyla. And I know that some of those may come up over the next couple meetings as we learn more, but if you have any right now, please send them to Twyla. She'll make sure that they get typed up so that everybody can read them on the screen and we can discuss them appropriately. So. Okay, if there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Get it done.